Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the next chapter of our adventure, finding our path through life, and with Mesilas Yesharim, Path of the Just. We're going to start the third parak this week, Mezrat Hashem, third chapter. Just a very brief background. As remember, we spoke about last week, the first thing a person needs to do when he wants to mount this spiritual ladder to become close to Hashem, which is the purpose of our life, is this thing called zehirus, which we variously translated as watchfulness or carefulness. I wanted to say, if you wanted to give one word for it, the word should be think. The nature of a person is not to think, but the nature of a person is to follow his habits. And usually those habits are dictated by his lower self, his physical self. So this means that if a person abandons himself to his habituation, he doesn't think about what he's doing. He just allows himself to run like a stallion in the charge of battle. It's one of the Mashalim that he employed. So he inevitably will find himself falling off the cliff. He'll become a picture of like a lemming. You know, this is really a lot of society today, like lemmings plunging off this cliff with absolutely no idea what happened to them before they even get there. They just... So that's what you're supposed to do. You have to think. You have to think. You have to think. But, of course, the Mesilas Yesharim doesn't just tell you that that's what you have to do. He tells you how you're supposed to do it. What are the methods? So he says, and we're reading now, I'll read in Hebrew and translate at the beginning of Parak Gimel, Bavir Chelke HaZehirus, to explain the parts of what we'll call Zehirus, watchfulness. I don't think I'll translate it. Being careful, thinking. Somebody who wants to supervise himself, to watch himself. He needs to do two things, two outlooks, two ways of looking at what he's doing. One of them is what is the true good that a person should choose? Yinos mimenu, and the true evil that he should run away from it. Now it's interesting if you notice that, and this is a point he comes back to several times in the book, that when we're talking about good, we talk about choosing good. And when we're talking about evil, we don't talk about not choosing evil. We talk about running 100 miles in the other direction. Because a person, the nature of evil is not just that if a person has to positively make himself as distant as possible from evil, because the nature of evil, especially when it's connected with a person's desires, is extremely attractive. It's magnetic. It sucks you in. So a person just can't stand still. I think somebody once gave the mashal of life is a bit like an elevator that goes down. Right? The only way you're going to get anywhere is to run 100 miles in the other direction very fast. Because the nature, if you stand still, the elevator naturally will take you down. Why? Because the nature of a person is that he's physical. And it's only by employing his higher self, his seichel, and thinking that naturally if he just stands still and like turns off, he'll go down. So he has to run. You have to run in the other direction. It's not just enough to casually, walk away. So that's why I think Davka says when he's talking about good, you choose good. And when it comes to evil, you run away from evil. So first of all, you have to clarify. That's what we're talking about. Clarify what really is really good and what really is the evil, what's really evil from which I have to run away. That is the first part of being a zohir. The first step that a person who wants to think, watch himself. How does he think? What does he think about? He has to clarify what is the true good and what is the true evil. The Hashniya, and the second part of this process, is alamaisim asherhu oisa, on the actions that he does. He has to superintend, he has to examine, analyze his actions, the ros im heim bechlalatov, whether they fall into the category of good or into the category of michlal ra. Now, before we move on, there's something that I want to point out here. I think I pointed out before, but I think it's worth saying over again. It's worth repeating. If you think about it, the first part, what does he do? So first of all, you have to decide, you have to analyze what's the true good and the true evil. And the second part is that you have to work out what your actions are. Now, why couldn't he have just said that a person has to sit down and think about whether what he's doing is good or bad? Right? Why not just sit down? Why do I have to have this kind of intellectual, abstract conversation with myself about what really is good and what's really bad? I should sit down and think, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing what's right or not? I didn't say anybody write this, but it seems to me that maybe one answer to this is that the nature of a person is Odom nogea ba'atzmo. A person is no more biased than when it comes to himself. The nature of a person is, it's very difficult for a person to believe that he's evil. I mean, maybe it's possible in certain sort of, psychotic, but most people, and I think I mentioned this a while ago, that my Rabbi once told me that there's this letter, or I don't remember if it was a letter or if he spoke, but apparently Al Capone, you've heard of Al Capone? Right? The notorious gangster. I mean, so notorious was he that his name is still current now, some nearly 100 years after his demise. It was in the 20s, right? So Al Capone believed that he was really a very good person. And, he was a serial murderer. And yet he himself believed that he was really okay. He had a difficult childhood, there were extenuating circumstances, but he really believed he was okay. The nature of a person is that he believes that he's okay. It's very difficult for a person to think that he's doing things which aren't right. And therefore, I think we spoke about this in different contexts with cognitive dissonance, which is a psychological phenomenon, which is what this is dealing with. Cognitive dissonance says that a person wants assonance. He wants consonance between his actions and his beliefs. So if a person believes he is a good person, which is we say a person tends to believe, so therefore necessarily, if I'm a good person, then therefore what I do is therefore necessarily good. In which case it's a vicious cycle, and the person will never emerge with doing anything more than what he's doing. It's a self-fulfilling prediction. Because I'm a good person, therefore what I do is good, and therefore, by definition, there's nothing to be changed over here. A person will never get anyway that way. I think I gave you the parallel of cognitive dissonance example of a car. A person buys a car, and he sees this car in the showroom, it's beautiful, gleaming, yellow or something with chrome all over it. And he takes it out and he buys it and it costs a pretty penny, and he takes it out in the street and he's cruising around town, and it's really, gewaldic. Everybody's looking at him and he's got his, behind the wheel, he's having a great time there. And then he decides to take it out on the freeway. Now, this car is about as comfortable as a board on the freeway. It's noisy, it handles, it's like trying to steer a boat on the river. It doesn't handle well. Now, he's got two possibilities. He can either say, hey, I bought a lemon. I messed up. Or he can say, something, he can play down the dissonant feelings that he has, that he understands that the definition of a good car is a car that should drive very nicely on the highway, thank you very much. And he said, well, that's really not very important because, most of the time I poodle around town. And therefore he can, so to speak, make peace with his actions by altering his beliefs. In life, people tend to find it much easier to change their beliefs than to change their actions. It's much better to say, what I'm doing is okay, and maybe it's not so okay, yeah, but it's not so bad. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a nice HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's not going to punish me. It's okay. I'm really, I'm okay. It's not so bad. It doesn't, really matter if. I think we've all had these voices in our heads at some point in our life, and we will continue to have them because that's the nature of a person. A person seeks consonance between his beliefs and his actions, and it's much easier to change your beliefs than your actions. And we said beliefs, your views, your opinions. And that's why I think the answer to my question is why a person has to start off in a disinterested, or as much as disinterested as possible, conversation with himself about what is really good in life and what is really bad, and arrive at, as much as you can, of course, disinterested conclusions as to the true nature of good and the true nature of evil, And then, in that sense, so to speak, that's a way of locking yourself in that you now can't exercise your cognitive dissonance. You now have to say, well, hang on a second, you just told me that X, Y, and Z is bad. But hang on a second, where that's what you're doing. So, hello. That way, you've at least got some chance of being able to recognize the things that need to analyze your actions in some kind of constructive way. And that's what he says here. We just go through it again now, and I think what he's saying, first the person has to, Yisboinen has to look carefully what's the true good that he should choose and the true evil he should run a million miles from. And the second part is that he should examine his actions, which he does, and to see which category are they in. Okay. So that's step 1 and step 2. Now step 2 divides into 2 subsections. 1 is at the time that you do the action, and step 3 is after you've done the action. Again, this is called thinking. This is called analyzing, am I doing the right thing or not? So, v'zeh b'shah ma'aseh v'shelo b'shas ma'aseh. B'shas ma'aseh, at the time of choosing to do an action, whatever it is, shelo ya'aseh shum ma'aseh mibli sheyishkol oisa be'oznei zos hayediyah. A person shouldn't do anything without first evaluating it, weighing it in the scales of this intellectual process that we talked about. He has to, having come to his analysis of what's truly good and what's truly bad, he then has to look at whatever is presented in front of him. All of us are presented with choices every single day, with all kinds of different things, whether to skip the minyan, daven at the koisel, as people say, in their bedroom wall, or so at each time the person has to say, well, hang on a second, what does the halacha require of me? What does the Kadosh Baruch Hu want from me? So he has to analyze that before he does it. Where does this fit in? Is this one thing that I'm about to know now, does that into my determined, the things that I've already decided are good? Or does it fit into the other category of things that I shouldn't be doing? And so that's, the second part. Once you've decided what's good and what's bad, and now you have to evaluate your actions, you have to evaluate your actions before you do the action, to weigh that in the scales of that knowledge that you've already set aside in the first step, number 1. And also after you have done it. Now I think basically after you've done it I think what he's saying here is basically, let's assume that a person, and maybe we shouldn't assume this, but let's assume that a person made this shikul, hadas, this evaluation, and he decided that what he wanted to do was good. Let's take an example. He decided he's going to daven in his room because he didn't get much sleep last night, and if he goes to minyan, he'll be too tired to go to shir, so it's better that he davens at the wall. Now, and he does that. He davens at the wall. Now, afterwards, he now has to make another reevaluation. That thing that I decided, given my original shikul hadas, my original evaluation, was that true? Was that really true what I did? Or maybe that was just an excuse. Maybe he goes to shir and he falls asleep anyway. I don't know. Maybe that wasn't such a good choice. So a person has to evaluate the choices that he makes before he makes the choice and also after he's made the choice. B'shas ma'aseh, we said already, not at the time of the action, sheyale lefonov, that it should arise in front of him. Zichron klal ma'asov, the remembrance of all of his actions, v'yishkol osam, and retroactively he should now evaluate those kamokain in the same way, b'moznei hamishkal hazeh, with the same intellectual process of having his, decided what the true good and the true evil is. Liros, to see ma sheyesh bom mehara, in order to see what was of those choices were evil. Leman yidche oisoi, in order to push that away, to not make that same mistake again. Uma min atov, or also the other side, which is that a person should analyze his actions to see what was good about them. It's not just a question of being negative. A person should think to himself, you know something, that was a good choice. How can I utilize that? How can I be matmid in myself? How can I hatmada? How can I accustom myself to do this same action, and also by extrapolation, other things which fall into this category? When a person does something and he evaluates and he says, you know, that was a good move, I'm glad I did that, I see that was right. So that should give him a certain consciousness of not just that particular action, but also he should be able to extrapolate, and to extrapolate that into, and plug that back into his life. And by this process of iteration, automatically, and we'll see this later on, automatically a person will grow. Because if he's honest with himself, he will start to weed out the things which are bad, and he will start to enforce the things which are good, which of course will make him instinctively more happy with himself. And when a person is happy with himself, he tends to grow and to be more receptive to growth. You know, one said, I think it was Rav Noach Weinberg Zatzal said, the opposite of happiness is not unhappiness, it's apathy. When a person, actually this is really Purim Torah about apathy, and Haman, Amalek, is the voice in a person that says, why bother? There's nothing going on here. Laced in, laced down, there's no judge, there's no judgment. That's the voice of Amalek. When a person does something which is good, instinctively his neshama feels this, and it gives him the proactiveness to be able to grow and to do more of the same thing. And on top of that, it also gives him this siyat dishmaya, that Hashem will then come, as we spoke about in previous weeks. Yeah, it says that im ein ani li mili, if I'm not for me, who is for me? But when a person is prepared to go to bat for himself, then Hashem will turn up and give him tremendous siyat dishmaya. So this process of evaluating what was good and deciding that I'm going to habituate myself, accustom myself. Again, habit. A person can choose his habits. We spoke about how the nature of a person without thinking, that he will follow his habits to his detriment. But a person can also choose to have good habits. For example, I'll give you a very good idea of a habit you don't even think about. Did you make a decision whether to brush your teeth this morning? Assuming you did brush your teeth. I don't think so. Why? Because from the age of dot, your parents made you brush your teeth. Now that's a habit. That's a great habit. Because why? Because you see nowadays people's teeth are considerably better than they were in the 17th century, where they never heard of toothbrushes. But you don't think about it. It's just something that you do by rote, by habit. And habit's great, because what it can do is it takes what you've already learned, and it pushes it into a place of your mind where it allows you to concentrate in getting on with the more important things of life, or let's say the new challenges of life, which will require you to think. So having done this process of thinking, and having identified the good actions that you're doing, and having decided to strengthen those, eventually they will become habitual. And you will see that you are now doing things that maybe a year ago. Person comes into Ohr Somayach probably, and he finds many things are challenging, and he starts to do it, and then probably 6 months later he doesn't even think about doing it anymore. You know, maybe the first couple of months here he thinks, should I put on tefillin? By the end of the year, that's not something you think about. I get up, I put on tefillin. The problem is that afterwards you start to put tefillin on without any kind of kavanah, with the rote, right? So that's a different problem. That's where habit can become destructive. But habit doesn't necessarily have to be destructive. Okay, that's a bit of a diversion, but let's get back on track here. So, what do? You have to, again, let's just chazar what we said. Evaluation, what's good and what's bad. Step 2, before you do something, which category does this fall into? Then after you've done it, was I right or was I wrong? And as we said, I have to weed out the things which were wrong and strengthen the things which were good. Now, ve'im yimtze behem minara, as we said, if you find something which is evil in his actions, Oz Yisbonein, he should be mitbonein, he should... what?
Eradicate?
No, it doesn't. Yitbon means to look into, havana. Bina, he should examine, v'yachko b'sichloi. And this is really what I was... Well, actually, it's the other side what we're saying. In his intellect, Eza tachbula yaseh, which kind of stratagem he needs to do, l'sor min hara hahu, to turn aside from this evil, v'litaher mimenu, and to purify himself from it. Now, there's a beautiful from the Vilna Gaon here, which I wanted to go into. This idea of yisboinein v'yachko b'sichlo. There's one step which is an intellectual process, and there's another process which is this discovering a tachbula, a stratagem. There are two parts to this. There's again analysis and action. So, the Vilna Gaon already said, discussing a pasuk in Mishlei. The pasuk in Mishlei is, you won't have this in your book, I'm sorry, in Perek Chaf, 20, Yud Ches, 18. And the pasuk says as follows. Machshavois be'etza tikoin. Thoughts with advice you should prepare. U tachbulois ase milchoma. And with strategies, make war. Again, thoughts with counsel, with advice you should prepare, and strategies you have to make for the war. He says that a person who wants to serve Hashem, he has to, first of all, do this first step, which is machshavos be'etzah tikon. He has to consult with people who are wise. He has to consult with people who have already managed to conquer their yetzer haras. People in a position who can give him eitzah. His machshavos, his thoughts as to how to deal with his yetzer hara, has to be carried out through eitzah. He has to take advice from people who are kavar b'derech Hashem. And in order that he shouldn't stumble on the stone, this large rock, which is the yetzer hara. But after lilchom im yetzer hara tzarech ba'atzmoi la'asos tachbulos. But that's not enough. He now has to work out, based on that thought and that advice, ruses. How do you say? Stratagems in order to keep him away from the yetzer hara. It's not good enough just to have this advice, to consult with the wise and think out. You have to devise strategies for the future. And I think this is something actually that we've mentioned in previous times. That the yetzer hara is a malach. The yetzer hara, once he has you in his grips, is extremely difficult to escape. He's a malach, he's a spiritual power. But the yetzer hara has one thing which is a tremendous weakness, which he has only one tense in his head, the present tense. Now. Do it now. The yetzer hara will allow you to make tachbulot. He will allow you to make stratagems, to plan out how you are going to avoid him. I don't know, for example, let's say you know that you have to go downtown, you have to go somewhere where people are not going to be tznius. So you can think about how it is that you maybe can go downtown where you have to pick up your glasses or something at an earlier time. I mean, the yetzer hara is not going to say, no, go downtown where in the middle of summer where nobody's dressed tzniistic and in the middle of the day when everybody's there. He's not going to say, no, you have to go. He's going to let you, the yetzer hara lets a person plot against him. And that's why it's so important to make tachbulot, to make plans, to make stratagems. He's not going to stop you doing that. He only has one tense in his head. It's interesting, I'll mention this by the by, that I remember many years ago, I didn't read it when he wrote it, but in 1957, I wrote it a little bit after that, there was a book by George Bluestone called Turning Novels into Films. And he discussed really how a person takes the written word and translates it into the language of film. Now, the whole concept of film being a language was a big chiddush when it happened. Because when film originally started, there was no such thing as a narrative in film. Film was just understood to be some penny arcade entertainment where people would pay, a few pence to go into a darkened room and see horses jump out of the wall. And it was all about spectacle. The idea of narrative, of eliciting emotions or telling a story, was something nobody thought of. That film could have a syntax like the written word, nobody thought of that. Until, according to film historians, the first moment where film started to develop its baby leg, so to speak, of being able to have a syntax, like a structure and an ability to communicate an idea, an emotion, a narrative, a story, was in a movie made at the turn of the 20th century called Grandma's Looking Glass. Now, Grandma's Looking Glass is about 2.5 minutes long. I don't think it'll win any Oscars. And it consists basically of this young child wandering into his grandmother's room, picking up her eyeglass and looking around the room at various things through this looking glass. What made this film so special was it was the first example of the use of what's called a point of view shot, POV. Now, a POV shot is something which you accept so naturally you don't even realize it's happening. Basically, up to that point, if you want to see somebody doing something, you pointed the camera at them doing it. So the child would go around and you just watch the child doing what he was doing. A point of view shot goes like this. The child picks up the eyeglass, he puts it to his eye, and you watch him do that. And then the next thing you see is what he's seeing through the spyglass. That is the beginning of what we would call syntax, of ways of using film in a way which approximates to some extent to the written word and a part of the tools of narrative. He says something what he says in that book is something very interesting. He makes an observation that film, very much like the Yetzer Hara, and you can extrapolate on that if you want, has only one tense, the present tense. There's no past tense in film, there's no future tense in film. In point of fact, when the narrative of a film calls for a memory or a prediction, let's take a memory, it's probably easier. What happens? The character goes, oh yes, I remember it now. It must have been about 25 years ago, right? The sound starts to echo and the picture goes all like this, right? And then what happens is you're back and people are speaking in the present tense. Film cannot do anything about was, he did. I'm using this as a mashal for the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is like a film. The Yetzer Hara will let you do anything you want in the future. He's not going to stop you. In the present, he's got you. So that's basically what he's saying in this pasuk. He's boinein v'yachko. Again, the same idea. A person has to introspect, investigate, besichlo with his intelligence. And which tachbulos yaseh, how he's going to use plan, stratagems, evasions, laso min hara hahu v'litaher mimenu, to escape from this evil and purify himself from it. Okay, I think we're going to pause here because I think to get into the next section, do you have any questions?
How do you make sure that you analyze correctly, like no justification?
Well, that's a very good question. The answer is aseh lecha rav kanei lecha chaver. That's why there are rabbis, and that's why there are friends. So this is something you can discuss, and especially specifically when it comes to your application of what you may have assumed to be. Actually, there's some other point here that I wanted to... Yes, I missed out something here. Actually, let's go back. because I missed out an important point. I'm sorry. Yeah. So on this same idea, Yizboinon v'yachko b'sichloi, he has to delve into and to investigate with his seichel. Thank you for reminding about this. Some kind of evasion strategy. Now, he says here, this is Rav Wolbers itself, says this is the beginning of practical work, of working, serving Hashem. He gives a little introduction. There is a Holech biyoshro yireh Hashem. This is, I think it's a posuk. He doesn't say where the posuk is. Holech biyoshro. He has to go. Yashar means straight. In his straightness, that is a yiras Hashem. A person who goes in his straightness, he will fear Hashem. He's a yiras Hashem. Because this is important, that everybody needs to go in his own way. Because the character traits of one person different to another person, very different one to the other. We all know this. And because of this, that a person who finds himself habitually committing one Aveira comes from a certain character trait that he has, a certain way that he is, and he therefore needs to make a boundary for himself, to make a protective wall, to keep himself far away from this particular problem. And maybe his friend doesn't need to do this at all, because he doesn't have that problem. But he will have his other problem that he will have to make his own protection for. And that's why it means Holech biyoshro, the one who goes in his straightness. B'derech hayosher shalo. He's medayik in the pasuk. It doesn't say Holech biyosha, the one who goes in straightness. It's in his straightness. Everybody has to figure out for themselves. And it could be that in the eyes of other people, what he's doing is wrong. Maybe they think he's being too frum, or he's not being frum enough, because they don't understand what this particular person needs. And nevertheless, he shouldn't become like an automaton and just do. And of course, we're not talking about doing things outside the halacha, you understand, this is for sure. We're saying that a person, even if he's doing something which other people don't normally do, and again, he doesn't have to show off about this. If it's something that other people don't do, there is an idea of al tifrosh min hatzibur, but if he understands that he needs to be very strict with himself in a certain area, and other people would consider this to be meshuga frum, that shouldn't bother him. Even though that because he is going, of course, has to be honest, and it has to be, as we said, arrived at in consultation. This is very distant from what happens a lot of the time, is somebody who wants that everybody should see him as being, great, and to praise and find favor and praise in the eyes of others, that everybody agrees with everything he says. A person has to be prepared not to mimic everybody else, just to go along and do what everybody else does. A person has to sit down and see what he himself needs individually. Yeah. That's basically what he says here. This is based on the Gra as well. So he just sums it up. Based on this, therefore, a person, when working out how it is that he's going to avoid the traps that he knows he's prone to, he has to, each individual person has in an individual way, has to sit down and figure out his own problems, his own weaknesses, and his own solutions. And then that's what I read before, I skipped this bit. And that happens by consultation with people who've managed to succeed, to take their advice, but then to extrapolate that and to personalize that for himself. Okay, very good. All the best. We'll see you next week. Sure.
How can you tell when it's your Yetzer Hara telling you not to or to do something, or when you're just genuinely like weighing trade-offs?
It's generally.
Just weighing trade-offs. Just weighing like is there ever a time where it's the Yetzer Hara is right, or it's not the Yetzer Hara? You're just deciding what.
That's what he's basically saying. You're saying that you have to think about something beforehand, not just rush into doing something.
Yeah, I'm thinking about going to yeshiva. Obviously, no one's gonna say it's a bad idea, but there are other factors at play, whether it's your age, your money, or your situation, or whatever.
Right.
Some people would say that's your Yetzer Hara convincing you not to go to yeshiva, and some people would say, no, I want to go to yeshiva, but weighing trade-offs is not Yetzer Hara. It's genuine. I'm actually just deciding if it's the right decision for me at this time right now. How can you tell what's Yetzer Hara and what's not? Okay,
so I think we also sort of touched on that aseh lecha rav, kaneh lecha chaver. A person, everybody, every Jew needs a rabbi, which is somebody who has to be, says that he has to seem to you like a malach Hashem, somebody who you have a tremendous appreciation for, who you respect tremendously, who is a Talmid Chacham, and who knows you well. Without those three qualifications, I don't think you'll get a good answer. But if you can find somebody, it's not always easy to find somebody like that, but Hashem helps. You find somebody who you think is great, you think he's a person who's really got himself together, and he's a holy person, and he's Oved Hashem, and he's a Talmid Chacham. He knows halacha, and he knows you, and he knows your personality, and he knows your background, and he knows your capabilities. This is the way that a person, that's the eitzah that we're talking about, the advice you have to get from people. So that is something I think that's very doable. You're not alone. You don't have to make these life decisions, and you for sure shouldn't make these life decisions in a vacuum. But what is important to do is not go shopping for opinions. You have to, because that's where a person gets confused. A person has to choose, and it could be through your life you will choose different Rebbeim, but at any particular moment in time, this is my rabbi, this is my Rav, and I follow his advice. And also remember that there's two sides to this. Hashem also can bless the decision afterwards. And one of the ways he will do that is if you is a person who listens to the Chachamim. It could be that maybe it's not quite the right decision, but Hashem can change things that it turns out to be the right decision. But that is predicated on you playing the game, so to speak, which means, as we said, I won't go over it, and those three things.
Make it the right decision.
It could be, yeah, but I'm saying to make it the right decision has to be that you did yours, you did your part. Yeah. Okay, fine, great. We'll see you next week, B'ezrat Hashem, after Purim.